going to start to saying hello to the audience.
Wonderful, thank you.
Oh. Bueno, pues buenas tardes a todas y todos los asistentes que os conectáis desde la zona horaria de Europa y buenos días a las personas que conectan desde el continente americano. Muchísimas gracias por vuestra asistencia a la conferencia invitada de la profesora Carla Zembal-Saul, que se está emitiendo en directo a través de esta plataforma de Cisco Webex y que ha hecho posible esta conexión desde Pensilvania en Estados Unidos. En esta plataforma encontrarán un chat a través del cual podrán escribir las preguntas que deseen hacerle a la doctora Zembal-Saul y que al final de su presentación pues le trasladaré para que pueda responder. Las preguntas las pueden escribir en inglés o en español, que trataré de traducir de la mejor manera posible a la doctora Zembal-Saul. Good morning, Carla. Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much for accepting our invitation to participate in the Redes Innovastic 2021 conference. We are honored to have you today among us.
Oh, it's a privilege. I think I'm among friends because I see some people that I know in the chat, and hello to everyone out there. I'm wishing you a very productive conference.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so to get started today, the focus is on
sorry, Carla, if you want, I'm going to introduce you because maybe the audience don't know you, and I want to explain to the audience where do you work, and if you let me introduce to the audience, okay? Sorry about that.
I'm sorry. No, go ahead.
No, thank you. Bueno, pues os voy a presentar quién es la doctora Carla Zembal-Saul. Ella es catedrática de Enseñanza de las Ciencias en el Departamento de Currículum e Instrucción de la Universidad Estatal de Pensilvania, en Estados Unidos. Además, es titular de la Cátedra CAN de Educación STEM, de Ciencia, Tecnología, Ingeniería y Matemáticas en esa misma universidad. Y su investigación y experiencia se enmarca en colaboraciones entre escuela, universidad y comunidad en Estados Unidos y en el extranjero. Y se centra en el estudio de cómo los maestros en formación y en activo aprenden a involucrar a los niños en una sensibilidad científica igualitaria y a desarrollar prácticas científicas basadas en activos educativos sensibles y antirracistas. Su investigación actual se lleva a cabo con profesores y otros profesionales de la educación que trabajan tanto con estudiantes bilingües y recién llegados como con sus familias, en una comunidad que está experimentando rápidos cambios demográficos, para crear oportunidades de aprendizaje significativas y justas que sean relevantes a nivel local. Ha publicado más de 35 libros y capítulos de libro en editoriales de reconocido prestigio internacional y más de 40 artículos científicos en revistas indexadas en el Journal Citation Report. Y ha participado como ponente en más de 180 congresos internacionales. Ha dirigido 14 proyectos de investigación con una dotación económica total de más de $3,5 millones, obteniendo en el último de ellos una financiación de $2,1 millones. Y ha formado parte del comité asesor de otros 8 proyectos de investigación. Es miembro de la Academia Nacional de Ciencias, Ingeniería y Medicina, Comité de Enseñanza de las Ciencias, siendo coautora del informe El aprendizaje de los maestros de ciencias, mejorando oportunidades y creando contextos de apoyo, y del estudio que está en curso de Ciencias e Ingeniería en PK5. También es miembro de la Asociación Nacional para la Investigación en la Enseñanza de las Ciencias, de la Asociación Nacional de Profesores de Ciencias, de la Asociación Americana de Investigación Educativa, de la Asociación para la Formación de Profesores de Ciencias y de la Sociedad Internacional de Tecnología en la Educación, y ha sido Premio Nacional al Logro Escolar de Desarrollo Profesional Ejemplar en los Estados Unidos. Sin más, les dejo con la comunicación de la doctora Carla Zembal-Saul, titulada Recentering Sensemaking in Elementary School Science in the Wake of COVID-19, Reflections on Adaptability, Innovation and Social Justice. Carla, both the audience and I are expecting your presentation, so please proceed when you wish.
Thank you. I should have waited. Hello, everyone. It's lovely to be here today. It's also very difficult to be separated by distance. I had the privilege of being able to visit Spain several times, and I'll share a little bit about that in a moment. Asun was able to tell you a little bit about me as a teacher educator and a scholar and the kinds of things that I study and care about. But that integration of research and practice and collaborating with educators in school and in out of school settings is incredibly important to my work. So here's the Spain connection. I think I heard her mention the conference, the International Conference on Research and Science Education in 2017. And that was not only my introduction to Spain and to this research and practice community, but it was also my introduction to Joaquin. And I really, he met me at the first day of the conference and introduced me to his team from Alicante, and we have been friends and colleagues ever since. I was able to come back and visit in 2019, in March of 2019. We got to attend schools and meet children and teachers and attend professional development seminars for teachers in schools, and also see so much of the country, which is absolutely stunning. So new partners in between those two visits, part of the science education team at University of Alicante came and visited us in State College. They visited classrooms, met with teachers. Here's Asun and Carolina with a very good friend and colleague of mine who's a classroom teacher and professional development provider, Kimber Hirschberger. And so Kimber and I were planning on bringing the teachers that Asun and Carolina had visited in State College in the United States to Alicante. And that was scheduled for March of 2020. But at the end of February, we had to cancel that trip. And so I hope it's just postponed and that there will be a time that we can travel again. But much has happened since we were able to last connect with our colleagues at University of Alicante. And I should say that now we have a formal memorandum of understanding between Penn State University's College of Education and University of Alicante, thanks to Asun. So the pandemic year is what we're all here to talk about, how we reacted, what we noticed, how do we learn and move forward and innovate. It was quite a year for us. We learned a language that was new to us, maybe, in terms of flattening the curve and social distancing. There was a toilet paper shortage in the United States. I don't know if you experienced that as well. We used lots and lots of hand sanitizer. We figured out new ways to greet each other with the elbow bump was very popular here. And then there were campaigns, so masking up at Penn State. I think this is a little harsh, but the slogan that was everywhere on campus and in town was mask up or pack up. They were very serious about enforcing, once the lockdown was lifted, very interested in making sure that as students returned to campus, they were able to stay safe in the fall. And apparently in the US, we drank too much alcohol during the pandemic, and there are lots of tips on how to not do that anymore. So it was also a very politically charged year. It was a very contentious presidential election in which Joe Biden replaced Donald Trump as president of the United States. It was a year of firsts, Kamala Harris being the first woman of color to serve in the role of vice president. And then really troubling insurrection in January that was unexpected and has created a number of concerns that we're still dealing with today. So a contentious political year, and a year that was also charged, racially charged. One of those events being the murder of George Floyd at the hands of Derek Chauvin, police officer. And he was convicted just recently, just this year in 2021 of that murder. But it raised awareness and fed into the Black Lives Matter movement, and has also made us all more conscious of social justice issues in society and in education. However you look at this past year, it was a terrible toll, and the counting is being revised. Lots of deaths were missed. The numbers are relatively unbelievable. And so there's deep trauma that people are dealing with, families are dealing with all over the world. So I really appreciate the fact that the conference is really looking at the educational challenges in higher education in the wake of COVID-19 and the challenges that it presented. And when I pulled the themes of the conference, the themes, I think the presentation that I'm providing today is going to cut across multiple of these themes. And I wish there were translation services because I would love to attend more of the conference. I will apologize in advance that I'm not a Spanish speaker. I pick up some words, but when it's fast, I really have difficulty. So thank you for putting up with me and my English. And I do not in any way, shape, or form mean to come across as US centric in this work. I use examples from the US because they're examples that I know, but I understand that many other countries around the world have faced some of these concerns and have had to innovate in order to cope during the pandemic. So today, I'm going to backtrack a little bit about why it's so important to teach science in elementary school. And because equitable science sense making is a theme in this particular presentation, I'm going to share how we define that in my research group. The professional learning opportunities for teachers are going to be the primary focus, and those are to help teachers support children's science sense making and language development. So I'll share an example from our own research team here from a 5-year teacher professional development project. We'll look at the teachers and their learning and how we had to adjust to that. We'll look at our partners and our partnerships and how those partnerships had to evolve during a time of COVID. And then we'll look at pre-service teachers because that's sort of my day job. And I can't talk about working with classroom teachers and in partnerships with schools and after-school programs without bringing in our pre-service teacher colleagues. I'll identify some patterns of inequity that have come out of this work and these challenges that are concerning so that we can attend to them as we move forward. As we go through the presentation, I know that Zoom fatigue, we use Zoom predominantly as our platform for remote instruction at Penn State. So I know that Zoom fatigue is real. I've experienced it myself, and I'm sensitive to the fact that it is the afternoon for many of you, and that 2 hours, an hour and a half for presentation is a very long time. So if there are questions or if you need clarification, I believe Asun mentioned this as well, but please feel free to drop your questions into the chat, and the panel will kind of be watching that, the people who are helping, and we'll share those questions in the moment. So don't feel like you're going to interrupt me. This is a long session, and I'm hoping that a little interaction will make it more interesting and break up the time for you. So no Zoom fatigue, I hope. So let's start with science in elementary schools. It's one of my favorite places to be. If you cannot find me at the university, you will find me in kindergarten, first and second grade classrooms at our research site. There are a number of rationales for why people advocate for science in elementary schools, and I have to say that the ones that I hear most often are ones about even just in Pennsylvania, where I live, we have an increasing number of STEM jobs and careers than we have people to fill those positions. So there's a lot of focus on the STEM pipeline, preparing students for the workforce once they graduate. Those jobs in STEM disciplines and STEM fields tend to have higher pay, and they are also more stable over time. It comes with some concerns, though. You may have guessed from my tone that workforce development is certainly a viable argument, and it's important with equity if we're going to be thinking about making positions available in the future for all students who want to do that. Not that everyone will, but they should have the opportunity to pursue STEM careers. But in focusing solely on workforce, I think we miss the boat, especially with very young children. And so the argument that I tend to draw on more these days is one around science as a civil right. William Tate wrote about this, made the case for this in a JARST article in 2001. And in 1989, the UN General Assembly, when focused on early childhood education, talked about every child having the right to explore their world and have their ideas taken seriously. And this is so important. Children are naturally curious, and many of the things that they're trying to figure out have to do with the natural and designed world. So making sure that kids are equipped, that they come with intuitive ideas about how to do this work and how to build on that is something that's very important. We contextualize, science needs to be contextualized in these local communities to create relevance and interest. And I should add local impact to that list. And finally, provide the foundation. Science is a civil right. We want to provide the foundation for children to participate productively in society, whether or not they choose to go into a STEM career in the future. And I think that point is really brought home in the events of this past year, and at least in the United States, the anti-science perspective is strong and well and loud, anti-vaccinations, anti-science in general, and it's very concerning. So this is, for the future, this seems to be a very important emphasis. And in science, science literacy has been part of the conversation for a very long time. So as I mentioned, we know kids are naturally curious about the world and that they come to us with these already intuitive ways and intuitive language for doing investigations. They want to figure it out. And this is important because early opportunities to do science contributes to children's later interest and potential pursuit of science and academic success in science. So when kids have not had those science opportunities, there's a gap when they get into maybe third, fourth grade and beyond. So again, very important. Engaging in science practices supports the development of language and literacy practices. And this is based on relatively new research, incredibly powerful. And I'll talk more about that later. That piece becomes central, that as kids become more sophisticated in their science practices, they also become more sophisticated in their language practices and their literacy. So that really drives the current work that we're doing. And then we want to make sure that we cultivate a sense of belonging and becoming someone who is capable of using science or relying on science and science practices to investigate their world. And so kids feeling empowered, kids feeling capable is part of the equation as well. If you've paid any attention to the US, in 2012, the new framework for K-12 science education was released, and people tend to focus on this aspect here with the science practices, cross-cutting concepts, and core ideas, that idea that we can't just teach content. As kids engage in science practices, they leverage understandings and build new understandings of the content. And then there are cross-cutting concepts that move across science disciplines. But the part that hasn't received as much attention until now is the focus on interest and identity. And Phil Bell, who wrote the equity chapter in the framework, really talks about 5D science learning, not just three-dimensional, but five-dimensional to include interest and identity of children in that process. So with my colleague Betsy Davis, we just released last year a new book on sense-making in science. And sense-making is at the core, I think, to understanding a new vision for teaching science with children. And that's really about engaging kids in negotiating meaning and figuring it out instead of just learning about. So this co-construction, this collective building of understanding and explanation for phenomena is really central to sense making, and the idea that there's more to the language of science than written text. So the languages of science become important. And finally, my colleague Rick Duschel has talked about doing the lesson versus doing science. So oftentimes kids march through the lesson. We're not talking about that. We're talking about learning science by doing the science, by engaging in those practices, by engaging in argumentation and explanation building and so on. And there are a number of things that work against this in American schools. There's a strong emphasis on academic vocabulary, memorizing understanding instead of thinking about understanding in context. And we also have lots of informational texts. So students read about science rather than do science so that they can also develop their literacy skills. And then discourse of right answers. Who would want to do things where the answers are all known in advance? So really a sense-making approach tries to turn those impediments on their head by engaging kids in figuring out from data explanations for phenomena, and to do that in a learning community. And in recent years, we've extended our position on sense making, our understanding of sense making, to include equitable sense making. And Haverly and colleagues write about this as being disrupting those. So kids can have access, right? Like they can have a science class, or science might be taught, but that doesn't mean that it's taught in an equitable and just way. Excuse me. So what this encourages teachers to do is to actually be responsive, to understand, to notice and understand and respond to uneven classroom interactions. So the child that never gets called on, or there are all kinds of things that happen, the responses that get dismissed, really tuning into that and trying to disrupt these normative ways of knowing, and include language practices and cultural practices that usually are not legitimized in formal school spaces. So this is, again, access is important, but once you have access, making sure that that access is to just and equitable sense-making opportunities. And that requires the teachers. So whenever reform efforts come along, teachers are the ones in the end who are responsible for creating these reform-based learning experience with their kids in their classrooms. And in the case of this kind of work, it's likely that those teachers, through no fault of their own, it's unlikely that they've experienced this kind of science learning that we have been promoting. And they are probably not prepared in their teacher preparation or their professional learning opportunities to teach in ways that reflect this vision for science teaching and learning. And in the United States, many districts support at the elementary level or emphasize subjects other than science, and that ends up being language and literacy, as well as mathematics education. So with little people, if there's time for science, great. If there's not, too bad. They're going to focus on literacy and mathematics. And so we have to figure out innovative ways to integrate the curriculum to make sure that we have time and space for science sense making. So there's a real need for professional learning opportunities, and a lot of my work focuses in this space. So I'm going to lay out sort of the way that we're thinking about these professional learning opportunities for teaching, or professional development, it's sometimes called. Then I'll launch into the actual example of the work that we're doing. And one of the things that you can try to do as I walk through these examples is to see whether those professional learning opportunities that we're describing in our work line up with some of the things that we know from research. So in 2015, actually 2013, it started, I was part of a consensus panel for the National Academy of Sciences and Engineering and Medicine that developed a research report, a consensus report on science teachers learning. So we reviewed all of the relevant and contemporary research on this area and came up with a set of conclusions from the research findings, the empirical findings, as well as a set of recommendations. And through this work, there's a consensus view of effective professional learning features that came to the fore. And these include active engagement with time for interactions among peers. So we want to do this in community, and the teachers need to be engaged in the work. Analysis of teaching practices and samples of student work are also very powerful. To get those, you actually have to take what you're learning, go back to your classroom and try it, and then return to your professional learning community of teachers and begin to analyze and make sense using those samples and artifacts as evidence to think about teaching and learning and what you might want to change in your practice. It's not just about content, it's about the practices of science as well and the pedagogies. And so just making sure that we're attending to all of that in an interconnected way. We also want to make sure that we're connecting to local curriculum so that teachers can more easily see the connections between what's happening in professional learning and what's happening in the classroom. And we include administrators in our professional development work so that the kinds of things that we're doing will at least be coherent in some way, some noticeable way with school policies and practices, which oftentimes are in conflict with the ways that we're asking people to teach. We want to make sure that this is sustained over time and that there's explicit attention to diversity, equity, and inclusion as part of the professional learning experiences. So there are a number of shortcomings of traditional professional development. One shortcoming is that they're often short. We've known for years, for decades, that a one-time couple-hour professional learning opportunity does not achieve the goals that we're trying to get at. The goals are very ambitious. But it can be really good for raising awareness, getting teachers interested in other ways of doing things. I'm not saying that those kinds of experiences are not important, but they're not going to have a major contribution to the kinds of changes that we're asking long term. Oftentimes, PD is removed from classroom practice and classroom culture and the curriculum. I'm calling myself out here. This is an example of some professional development, this image that I did with teachers in Iowa. The goal, though, was to launch their new adoption of the next generation science standards. So we were trying to give them a feel of what might be different than what you do in your classroom. But we did not use teachers' curriculum or their practices and certainly did not know about the school cultures. They were from all over the state of Iowa. So individualized approaches. So what happens in the US is that either there's one kind of professional development session or workshop that the district arranges for every teacher, or there's a menu approach in which teachers can choose or select things that they're interested in to learn more about. The trouble with these individualized approaches is that they don't allow for capacity building. Either the individualized approach or the one-size-fits-all approach is not the way to build capacity. And then finally, my research team and I, as well as other colleagues, have been thinking a lot about this, that much of the professional development that gets planned and implemented begins with a deficit view of elementary teachers and science. And let me just share with you what some of those are, right? So a dominant deficit narrative in the United States is that we're designing PD. We have to design PD to fix elementary teachers because they don't like science, they can't learn science, they can't teach science. It's not possible. They're bad at it. They're scared of it. So this dominant narrative is incredibly negative and potentially damaging, especially if you start with that perspective. So we're not trying to fix teachers, we're trying to help teachers learn. And so there are shifts that have to happen to have a more possibility-centric narrative. A couple of my other favorites that aren't necessarily related to science teaching, and again, these teachers are largely generalists who teach all subjects, including science, in their classroom. But we hear, oh, you know, they're just glorified babysitters. They sit around and eat snacks with the kids all day and do crafts. It's not hard to be a teacher. That's a problem. Anybody who's been in a classroom with 5-year-olds or on a Zoom classroom with 5-year-olds knows that it is not glorified babysitting and that teaching is complex problem-solving work. Also, there's a sense that there's no specialized knowledge to be an elementary teacher. Anyone can do it as long as you like little kids. So these narratives, again, can kind of get in the way of what we plan in professional learning and how teachers are viewed as professionals. So we chose to flip the script as part of the title in the piece that Michelle Brown, Heidi Carlone, and I wrote about looking in a more possibility-centric way. What would it be like to plan professional development that considered elementary teachers' assets and the affordances of their elementary school context, which tends to be very different here than it is in middle school and high school. So elementary teachers tend to be holistic in the way that they view children. They have to think about their academic progress, but also their social and emotional learning, their ability to be safe and to be well. So all of these things, this larger view of who your learner is, I think gives elementary teachers an advantage. The teachers, because they're self-contained, many of them in elementary school, develop really deep relationships with children, and in doing so can come to understand or be aware of their cultural and linguistic resources. So again, getting to know the whole child and their background and what they can draw on for sense making. We also know from the literature that families are more likely to be involved with their children's schooling in early years. And so this is also something that family engagement has become a very important aspect of the work that we're doing. And that idea that families can connect in those early years is an affordance that we can build on. And then the elementary curriculum itself, as I mentioned before, is ripe for integration across all subject areas. So again, what would it look like if we started with the possibilities instead of the deficits? I'm not saying that we shouldn't pay attention to elementary teachers' content knowledge, but we shouldn't frame their whole existence as being about fixing. So we're really trying to play this balance. And as I go into the example, I hope that you can notice and see how some of this possibility-centric narrative is incorporated into our work. So before I get started on an example, I'm wondering, Asun, if there are any questions. I'll pause for a second to see, just kind of laying the background for the kind of work that we do. Now I'm going to zoom in on a specific project and talk about the impact of COVID on how we had to adapt and innovate in those spaces.
Carla, there is no questions yet in the chat. I think that all the audience is paying attention, and when you share with us the slide with the toilet paper, all of us I think in Spain we have the same problem, because in those days it was impossible to buy toilet paper, because all
Yes.
people were buying the toilet paper, because
yes.
maybe all of us were afraid. And for at the moment we don't have any questions. I have some of them, but I prefer to do these questions at the end of your presentation. But
okay, that
thank
sounds
you
good.
very much.
So let's dive in with the Science 2020 partnership. Given that the pandemic was in 2020, it's a really unfortunate name for the project. It was never meant to reflect the year. It was a play on words for visual acuity 2020 vision. So this idea that we're going to be working with emergent bilingual students, we call them English learners here. That's problematic in and of itself, but that's the language used by the federal government is English learners. The idea was to bring them in focus through a school-university partnership. So 2020 was meant to reflect that, but now it has a little bit of stigma, a lot of stigma attached to it. So this is a 5-year funded project from the Office of English Language Acquisition, which is a department as part of our Department of Education in the United States. So it's federally funded, and it's referred to the granting program as a National Professional Development Grant. This would be the last year, except for COVID, so we were able to get a no-cost extension, and we'll run through 2022. The guiding principles of this particular project are that we engage children as capable partners in knowledge building. Everything we do with children takes that as sort of the baseline. And so making sure that teachers who are in the program can recognize young children's brilliance is one of the things we have to do right up at the beginning of the professional learning. We also, another principle is to invite productive participation in sense making. So not just leaving it to happen, but making sure that there are opportunities, lots of different kinds of opportunities for engagement. And then cultural formative assessment is the driver for responsive instruction. So this is constantly checking in with kids and all of their ways of expressing what's happening and what they're learning and understanding, and using that to guide instruction, and doing that in a way that honors cultural and linguistic resources. The work is informed by another research synthesis from the National Academies of Science. This one is focused on English learners in STEM subjects. And the piece about this that is so compelling is that in STEM subjects, there are lots of different ways to engage in sense making, and it doesn't rely predominantly on having to use language to access meaning. So what this means is that the material nature of engaging in science practices with young children is a way that children, through their embodied actions, can begin to talk about or share their understanding without relying on language. They can collect data, they can look for patterns in data. Those things are all possible to do without being tied explicitly to language. And so when students are doing that kind of work, the language is also learned. So it's that idea of, as students become more sophisticated, as children become more sophisticated in their sense-making practices, they also experience language learning. So that was a very compelling piece for us. The project then has to take place in a community that has multilingual students. And so in the state of Pennsylvania, and this is a microcosm in many ways of demographic shifts that are happening across the country. So this is Pennsylvania over here on the East Coast next to New York, and we're on the eastern side of the state. Penn State is right in the geographic center of the state, and what we have over here to the east is the research site. That site in 2000 with the census was 93% white, that community. And due to these demographic shifts, we're at 56% Latinx in 2020, and many of those families are from the Dominican Republic. They have come to that area because there's an abundance of jobs. The city that we work in sits at the intersection of two interstate highways. And what has happened there is that there are a number of distribution centers for goods. There are meat packing facilities and things like that. So Amazon, for example, opened a very large distribution center with lots of low-wage jobs. And they really don't go anywhere, but nobody's taking them. So the families from the Dominican Republic have moved in, taken those communities, and really transformed what was a town that was experiencing some difficulties. The community, though, and the schools are now grappling with this rapid demographic change. And here's a little bit of why that's so stunning. This is a map of Pennsylvania, and this is actually reflecting the vote. Actually, Pennsylvania did go with Joe Biden in this most recent election. But what you'll notice is that Democratic candidates are represented as blue on the screen and red for Trump and Republican. And so what you see is the sea of red, the sea of conservative, anti-immigrant communities and districts all across the state, except for these like blue in each side and in the middle. And so this is Pittsburgh over here, the Pittsburgh area, so large city. This is where I live in State College, Pennsylvania. This is Center County, which votes more in a more progressive way. And then over here, this is Philadelphia, the Philadelphia area and surrounding suburbs. So you can kind of get a sense for there are progressive areas in cities, and then very conservative anti-immigrant policies in the rest of the state of Pennsylvania. And the horror of Trump, I think, made its way. This is the year that we visited. This was at the Festival of Fire, the display that was out of Trump and building the wall and sort of not caring who gets in the way as that happens. That plays out in a very real way in politics in Pennsylvania. So what we tried to do, the way that we worked is that we knew people in this community. We had a partnership there with a community center a few years prior to this project. We also, the superintendent of that school district at the time, the head of the school district, was from our community and State College, so he understood what we were trying to do. And so they were a really good choice for partners. So this is the Hazleton Area School District, educators and administrators, the Hazleton One Community Center, and Penn State and teacher education over here. So all of these partners coming together to focus on children, families, and community, and bringing access to equitable and just science education, as well as supporting their English language development. The professional learning itself, our signature pedagogy is focused on collaborative practitioner inquiry. And so what teachers do is that they attend workshops and sessions, but then they work with a team member to modify the approaches, adapt the approaches to work in their classrooms with their school culture and the children that they teach and the families that they serve. So they they have questions about how to implement this. They study their own classroom practices and student learning. They come back to other institutes and make that learning public, and reflect on classroom practices in ways that lead to change. And that's a really powerful inquiry cycle, and new questions are always coming up. So we, as a project team, co-design and co-teach with teachers in their classrooms. So this is not all teachers. This is at the very beginning of the project, where we really wanted to develop some connections in two particular inner city schools, and build some trust and then expand the program. So we spent the better part of 2 years every week in 2 different sites, working alongside of teachers and the children that they teach. We have to address the implicit biases that white monolingual teachers tend to hold about bilingual children and their families, or at least in this community, those implicit biases. And that is uncomfortable at times, but is absolutely necessary if you're aiming for equity. We also prioritize family engagement. Again, we were working with teachers in kindergarten, first and second grade. That's 5-year-olds to about 7, 8-year-olds. And so the opportunities to bring family in and connect with family and have family become partners in their children's learning was very important. We worked on all of these things: knowledge, beliefs, attitudes, practices, but also on teachers' identity. Many teachers had adopted the narrative of science is hard, I don't think I can do it, I don't feel comfortable with it. And it was part of our intentional work to help them feel comfortable, to help them have successes along the way and build their own identity as someone who can do this kind of work and support children's learning. This is sustained over long periods of time. So a cycle with these teachers, a set of cycles, spans an entire academic year. And I'll share more about that in a minute. And we include administrators. The principals of these buildings tend to come to the actual institutes and working sessions that we have with teachers, and sometimes participate actively in those. So the model that we use is across an academic year, we have these 3 cycles of inquiry where teachers are examining implementation practices in their own classroom and focus on children's learning. So we have institutes and then that job embedded professional learning. And all of that feeds into the inquiry cycles where teachers are doing, it's not formal research in their classroom, but they are certainly driven by questions and data in terms of some of their decision making. And then we co-design resources and tools with them, and that co-design with these deep dive teachers, this first cohort that we really invested in, those resources and tools that were co-designed then became part of professional learning in other sessions that were open to the school community. And then again, explicit attention to family engagement, inviting families in, designing specific after-school programs for families and children and teachers to work together, and so on. So this particular model, so that teachers would engage in 3 different questions that they were looking at in their own classroom practice over the course of an academic year. And these deep dive teachers have been with us. This is the 3rd year now that we've been working with a core set of deep dive teachers. When we're in the classroom alongside of teachers and their children, this is Ms. Frumpkin and her kindergarten class. These are 5-year-olds at the beginning of a school year. You can tell they're wearing the shorts, and they're very interested in what she's holding. And she used this particular organism. It's a Madagascar hissing cockroach. She used them as classroom pets, and they kept them throughout the year. And kids made observations. It guided their inquiry. This was sort of the entryway of seeing kids be interested and excited in trying to figure some things out about what this critter was, where it lived, what it ate, why it hissed, what caused it to hiss, and those kinds of things. So this wasn't about draw an insect and does it have all its parts and its legs in the right places. This was really about kids conducting inquiry in the classroom, but for the teacher, it was to be able to surface those cultural and linguistic assets that kids bring. If kids call it a bug, if kids call it something else. I had kids call pupa of these actually give the appearance of live birth, but pupa for mealworms, they were calling chicken fingers. Let them call them chicken fingers until we get to the point where we might start to introduce, when they start to understand that there's a cycle happening, then we can introduce scientific terminology or not. But these are things that are really that when you're with a teacher and you see you're co-teaching and you see that opportunity, you can take it in the moment, and then we step out over lunch or a planning period and are able to have conversations with teachers about our experiences together. So another thing that's very common in elementary schools is activity mania. So do a cute activity, it's fun, kids really like it and are engaged, and then nothing for a while and we go to the next thing. So the idea of a sustained investigation, that we were gonna, for in this case, keep critters all year long in the classroom and pursue multiple investigations around form and function and what these critters need to survive and thrive, those are all things that again, require sustained investigation, multiple observations to allow different questions that kids have to surface. And it's really about shifting. So this is a big aha for all of the deep dive teachers that we worked with. They're used to little kids asking questions and they would just answer it. And so science made them uncomfortable because they didn't always know the answer. And so really shifting to sense making, teachers became very interested in children's discourse and children's ideas and their ways of thinking and figuring it out and how to guide that along. So again, side by side in the classroom working with teachers. And I know that that's a huge investment and it's a very hard thing to think about scaling up, but we had to have this core group and proof of concept in some ways. One of the big things we hear from teachers in professional learning opportunities is that might work with those kids, but not my kids. And so we had to show how science and engaging kids in science sense making could actually work for the kids in that community. So our time with deep dive teachers was a very important investment that allowed us to move forward in that school district. And then accepting multiple ways of expressing and understanding. Children are very animated, their understandings are often embodied. And so showing what it looks like, working with teachers to have them see that, to recognize that as understanding and be responsive to that. And all of those things are made more powerful when you're together with teachers and their students in classrooms doing this work. So once we established those deep dive teachers, or you might think of them as case study teachers, we were able to expand in the two buildings, those two inner city buildings, elementary schools, we were able to expand to school-wide professional learning. So we did these in fall 2019 and we're planning them for the rest of the year, but you know what happened in March. But once a month, we had these voluntary face-to-face in the library after-school programs, and we engaged teachers actively in doing this work, sent them back to their classrooms with materials and the offer to provide some coaching and support when they tried to implement. And again, we use those resources from the deep dive teachers. So that was, we were headed to school-wide, and then our next step was going to be district-wide professional learning in this way. So, but we had COVID, the COVID lockdown. I should say that this is, it's a national professional development grant, but there's also a research agenda that goes along with that. And so our research agenda when COVID hit was the first thing to go. We went from all of our face-to-face work overnight on the 13th of March in 2020, and immediately all in-person research activities were canceled by the university. It was seen as a liability, a potential threat if someone on our team or on a research team were to get a participant, to transfer the virus to a participant. So that stopped, but our professional learning didn't. So we went back, the team kind of regrouped and went back to our original logic model for the project, in which we kind of mapped out our goals and our activities and the outcomes of those activities. And we found that many of the things, like the job embedded wasn't going to work anymore. The things that we had in that activity section needed to be modified drastically given the times. And so we had to shift to remote, and that's sort of the pattern that plays out here. Website development, online professional development, and I have to say the team was incredibly skeptical about what that would be like given our experiences working alongside teachers and students in classrooms. So we weren't hopeful, but there was no other way to do it. And so we went from these, job embedded collaborative inquiry team structures to remote professional learning. So we had 3 cycles before and 3 institutes, and now we do 3 online modules. There's video analysis of practice and artifacts. Teachers have to go out and try things and bring them back to the group. So in many ways, we tried to maintain as much of the integrity of the original thinking as possible, but adapt it for this online environment. And we did end up deciding to go to a district-wide virtual professional development. So we had been at the building level before. Because we were remote, this was an affordance. We were able to include more teachers to be able to participate. And we support their after school, we support their the inner city focus and the materials and development, those kinds of things in teachers' classrooms. So if they want to try something and they don't have what they need to try it, we make sure that they have that and that we're there for sort of remote coaching if needed. So each of these cycles that we have developed are 3 or 4 weeks long. They have synchronous and asynchronous components. Our themes that we really highlight are collaboration, inquiry, and family engagement. All of those pieces are evident in the work that we do, but we highlight and foreground different ones at different points in time. There are clear connections between research and practice, as with the original professional learning. And participants and their students receive the materials. Like we said, even though they're remote, we'll send them and make sure that everybody has what they need to do what a teacher might want to try as part of her inquiry. And that inquiry requires you to try in your classroom and then come back and share it. The sharing it means that it's not just stories about what happened, it's also artifacts of what happened. So we were able to maintain as much as possible given this unique environment. And I have to say, we're doing this right now, and it's quite surprising. The thing that has the asynchronous and synchronous components has been very helpful, as well as making sure that people are trying these things in their classroom before they dismiss it, right? So try it. That naturally raises questions that make really good fodder for practitioner inquiry. So a couple words about partnerships. One of the things, it's great to have partners, but those partners play out differently in different kinds of contexts. And the context that we were in here was a crisis, and the school district was seriously disrupted in their ability to provide learning opportunities for children. And so before we get too far into that, I want to share that when I talk about partnerships, this is a core part of the work that I do. There are multiple frameworks, and these are just 3 frameworks for engaging in partnership work. And in my particular research group, we tend to focus on a professional development school model. And in those models, the focus is on preparing the next generation of teachers and teacher educators. And so there's a simultaneous renewal. So everybody who's involved in that professional development school partnership, it has something to contribute, but they also have something to learn. So it makes teacher education better, it makes teaching and learning in schools better, and preparing that next generation of teachers. So the partnership here, just a reminder, we had the school district. So these were teachers, ESL teachers, administrators, district leadership, and so on. We also had the community center. It's the Hazleton Integration Project, runs that community center. It's an advocacy center that is frequented by many families from the Latinx community, the immigrant community. And they have after-school programs for the teachers. We had after-school programs for the teachers at the community center, so informal educators, not just school-based teachers. And over the course of this project, Penn State Once we had the deep dive teachers, we started to layer in the pre-service teachers and the teacher education component. So these three partners ebb and flow in terms of where particular kinds of work gets done and how. But the community center during the pandemic really ended up being a viable, a very productive and welcome collaborator. As I mentioned, parents and families from the community, the Latinx community are very visible and active as part of that community center. It tends to be a less threatening space for families and teachers to come together and focus on children's learning. So when they hold STEM events and families come in, we also invite local teachers. And those teachers tend to be the same. So the kids that come to the community center after school and in the summers are actually going to the inner city schools that we've partnered with. So there is some overlap. It's not all the same kids, it's only a subset, but there is a connection to their teachers in those home schools. And then after school, teachers, as I mentioned, participated in some of our professional development. We focused on engineering as elementary as an enrichment program for elementary students. And there's a very modest STEM lab on site there. So there are resources for us to be able to do this work when we go there. So during the pandemic, one of the things that the community center did was to survey families in the community about their needs. And one of the things that they found is that they oftentimes didn't have access to internet service at their home or devices. It often turned out that there were devices in the home that kids could connect with if they had internet, but oftentimes there was more than one child. And so if all the kids are in school during the same hours and they need to connect remotely, you need different devices for every child that's trying to attend school remotely. So they were very helpful at assessing the needs in the community. They also became, as part of this, a testing and vaccination site eventually for that community, so people could go to a place where they felt connected and comfortable. And then they created, so when kids were attending in the fall, when kids came back to school and they were attending school online, the community center set up a safe, socially distanced space for kids to come there, to get a device, to connect to the internet and do their school with a couple of monitors around to help with technology, but not necessarily to help with the teaching and learning. And then they were very supportive. When we came to them, one of the things that happened this academic year is that science was not often taught in the schools because of a strong emphasis on literacy and mathematics. And so to provide STEM enrichment or science enrichment, science and engineering enrichment at the after school program, that was welcomed. And the community center did everything from recruitment to permissions from parents for kids to be photographed and provided personnel for support. And they welcomed our pre-service teachers, our teacher education candidates, into the center virtually with open arms. So we felt very welcome and connected there. And we designed a virtual STEM internship. So this is a combination of, we've got a couple of members of my team here. We have Megan and Michelle. We have pre-service teachers. These are teachers who are helping to lead the work with young children. These kids are 2 hours away at the community center, and they're working on their coding and engineering projects. So the idea was to connect across these two spaces to support the pre-service teacher learning and to provide these enrichment and language opportunities for young children. You guys doing okay? Hanging in there? Okay, so the arrangements, we had weekly sessions between the pre-service teachers and the kids throughout the fall 2020 semester. Third grade students were at the community center, like I said, and the Penn State teachers were on campus here, and that's a 2-hour distance that would not have been possible to do every week if we were doing this work in person. We had facilitators at both locations, and we prepped materials and got them delivered in advance. We worked on engineering design challenges, and so we used something from the BBC called microbits. It's block coding for homemade devices, and so kids would have a design task, and then they would use their microbits to program and make the device do, or the whatever they made do something. The creation would do something. So we integrated very intentionally language development strategies for young learners, and we really emphasized attention to children's multiple ways of sense making and knowing, whether it was drawing, whether it was gesturing. And, you know, the kids, the piece that we had to give up was sort of the collective piece, but we did try and engage. The kids worked one-on-one with the pre-service teachers, but then we had facilitated large group discussions. Those pre-service teachers, every week, one meeting a week was with the kids, but they had 2 more meetings a week with us. So we met to plan out what we were doing that week. They would implement, we would record, and then we would come back together and analyze that video, identify students' ways of sense making, their cultural and linguistic assets, and then plan for the next phase of the project. So that worked really well, especially since for many of these pre-service teachers, they did not have an opportunity to student teach or to work in schools all of last year and even the part of the year before that during lockdown. And this is really a problem in the state of Pennsylvania. We have 500 independent school districts, and each one has autonomy to decide whether and how to host and work with pre-service teachers. So many of them, and we don't work at Penn State with all 500, but we work with several dozen of these school districts. And so every single one of them could choose whether or not to have the student teacher, the Penn State student, in the classroom with the mentor teacher, or if it had to be virtual, or sometimes they didn't allow our students at all. They canceled all education students in the classroom. So for our pre-service teachers, they were hungry for experiences to work one-on-one with children. They were really we had no problem recruiting Penn State students who were preparing to be teachers to engage in these internships. So remember that when we talk about, or when I talk about teacher education, I'm thinking about teacher preparation and teacher education at the forefront. That means that our students are in classrooms with researchers and project team members, as well as the teachers who are undergoing, are engaged in the professional development, and the children that they teach. So this is me working with a pre-service teacher in a deep dive teacher's classroom with her kids. And I think they're actually looking at that chicken finger I told you about earlier. So when that stopped, when March 13th, actually the Friday before that, kids went home, our teachers went home. Nobody knew that they weren't going to come back on Monday. It was very abrupt. And so our student teachers were very interested in staying connected with the kids. They were very worried about that. This was very traumatic for them, as well as for many of the students who, when they're 5 years old, develop a real connection with their teachers. And so they started their own YouTube channel called Aprende with Us, and they did English and Spanish translations of lessons. They sometimes did read alouds. They did engineering projects. They investigated worms. They did all kinds of things through this platform. And the principal, every time they had a new episode, the principal would send it out to the whole school community. And so you can see that some of these things have hundreds of views. Have hundreds of views. 151. Here's 328 views. For a product for designing. So and when we talked to the kids online, the kids had clearly seen these. So this was this was completely our students at Penn State decided that this was really important and that they wanted to do this throughout the rest of the school year during lockdown. Now, once lockdown was over, one of the things we had to do was move to this format, which is the live synchronous this format for kindergarten teachers. We've got team members, we have student teachers in here, we have a couple of classroom teachers who are our deep dive teachers, and then lots of kids on multiple pages would show up at specific times. And this was to continue investigations that we had started with them in their classrooms, which is exciting. So they had been, it was getting to be spring. We were going to plant a garden. We had lots of different kinds of seeds, and there had been an accident where they got spilled out onto the ground and then scooped up. And so the kids, like, what are we going to do, was sort of the context for science at home. And so the kids immediately know, like, well, we have to sort those out. And then, oh, those don't look like seeds that I know. Are they really seeds? And then they knew you had to stick them in the ground to try and figure that out, if they would grow or not. So data became really important. Collecting and using data became a really important tool. And so since we were running the investigation separate from being in the same space with the kids, we had lots of video, lots of images, and data charts that mapped onto the way that we were growing the seeds. But through all of this, we really tried to prioritize relationships and connection. So the first 15 minutes of every session with 5-year-olds was them saying hello to each other, how much they missed each other, sharing things that they had drawn and written, or that they were reading, or that they were eating, or a favorite toy, a favorite pet, all kinds of things. But that was so important for their social emotional well-being during that time. And then we would launch into lots of questions and investigation together. We oftentimes used everyday objects and materials in the home. We try to do that anyhow, but sometimes we would say, okay, for next time, go around your house, see if you have are there any seeds in your house, or are there any plants in your house or outside your house? So those kinds of things. We really worked on fostering a sense-making community, so not talking over each other, so that kids would share their idea, and we were able to start some of the agree-disagree language, or can you, tell me more, I don't understand, for clarification. We valued through all of this multiple language resources, linguistic resources, and we gained insights from a home visit. Home visits are a practice that's very hard to achieve, but highly recommended. And it's just was not possible to do in person. But we oftentimes saw a family member, not necessarily a parent, but a family member working with a child on their science investigations. And then schools decided that learning loss, and this happened in the district where we work. It also happened in our local school district here in State College, as well as a number of other places. But that little kids, there's going to be too much learning loss in mathematics and in language and literacy, so there's not time for science, which is incredibly short-sighted. And if we take up science as a civil right, like we talked about in the beginning, it's highly problematic. So through all of this example kind of sets the stage. Even before the pandemic, there was a denial of opportunities to participate in science sense-making that happened in elementary schools. The number of pull-out services, such as English as a second language, or special education, or literacy remediation, all of these things, they tended to pull out kids when they were doing science because they wouldn't miss anything. That's problematic practice from the beginning, and it's an inequitable practice because, as we said in the beginning, by engaging in science sense-making and science practices, that also supports language development. And there's actually some really interesting research about that kids who had more remediation around language did not do as well as kids that had more opportunities to do science instead of that pullout during that time. So some really interesting and powerful research to back up this idea that that's not the right time to take kids out of the classroom. And then that was further exacerbated when science kind of went to the wayside so that they could focus on literacy and mathematics in schools this year. They do it anyhow, right? But this year especially. So there are disproportionate negative effects, not just from the pandemic, but certainly exacerbated by the pandemic for students with disabilities, students of color, English learners, immigrants, and students from communities that are under-resourced. So the pandemic has revealed even further this already troubling pattern of inequity. And all of this is exacerbated by social and economic inequities, access to healthcare, access to broadband and devices, as we talked about earlier, and parents working multiple jobs to make ends meet, and oftentimes the essential worker roles in the community, in grocery stores, in meat packing plants, and so on. So this is something that I think we need to definitely keep in mind as we forge ahead. So, and forging ahead with intention. We're not going back to normal, nor do I think we want to. We have to make change. We have to have that reflect a social justice agenda in many ways to make sure that everyone has access to these kinds of learning opportunities and that teachers feel empowered and capable to do the work. In the United States, what happened is the National Academies commissioned a report that looked at the benefits and the drawbacks and the innovation and adaptation, like what happened during COVID, how was it possible to continue to teach science, what did that look like? And they came up with some foundational principles in this publication that I think really reflect some of the things that we've been talking about. So as we plan and move forward in the work of teaching science in school, in K-12 in this case, the idea would be that we maintain the focus on the framework's vision for high quality science and engineering. That means that it's essential for all kids at all grade levels for many of the reasons that we talked about, that I talked about before. The instruction focuses on student engagement with real world problems and local problems. So this became so important that it plays out in this document in really interesting ways. And we still want the three-dimensionality of it, not just learning the content, but engaging in practices. Prioritizing relationships, equity, and the most vulnerable students is right up there in this set of foundational principles as being very important in order to have welcoming learning environments. We have to pay attention to these things. Families and communities also identified as being very important and critical assets for science and engineering learning. There are a number of different approaches and ways that people are doing that in this particular document. And then approach recovery from disrupted learning and adjustment to changing learning environments as ongoing processes that take time. There's a real concern that we're going to be so focused on learning loss and measuring learning loss that we're not going to get on with the business of learning. So taking kids where they are, yes, there will be differential disruption to the learning that happened during this time of COVID, but let's figure out where kids are and help move them forward than spending all of this time trying to diagnose and measure and further put behind the work of learning in schools. So shared challenges invite collaboration and innovative solutions. I know that the science education group at University of Alicante is also cares very deeply about these kinds of initiatives, working with teachers, working in schools, working in partnerships. But as we move through this next piece, let's recenter equitable science sense making, and let's do it together. There's so much to learn from one another, and I'm so glad that you're having this conference to be able to share some of those innovations along the way. I have to say a huge thank you to you and the organizers, but also a huge thank you to my team. This work is a lot of hours. It is a lot of time together. We're like our own little family, and they have been phenomenal all along. And especially during COVID, to make sure that the teachers and the children and the community that we work with is at the front and center of everything that we're doing, both research and practice. So they're wonderful. I hope that you can meet them sometime, but it does take a village. So with that, Asun, I am going to turn it back to you to moderate any discussion. I hope that wasn't too much Zoom fatigue for people. And I hope that I didn't botch the the language piece.
Thank you very much, Carla, for your exciting and inspiring presentation. We are thrilled with it, and proof of that is the questions arrows in the chat. We have some questions, and interesting questions also. I'm going to make you for example, the first question is from Joaquin.
Oh, hello,
Professor,
Joaquin.
is the Professor Joaquin Martinez Torregrosa, and he wrote the question in Spanish, and I'm going to translate in English the question. And is
Okay.
how are the differences between a school focus on literacy or math and another one focused on science? Does it produce a specialization in the teachers in the school, for example, in science teachers or math teachers, and does it affect to the organization of the school?
So that's a very interesting question, and there's a lot of discussion about this. We tend not to have specialists in the United States. Most elementary teachers who teach pre-kindergarten through fifth or sixth grade, depending on which state you're in, are prepared as generalists. So they have to, and in that preparation of generalists, I think it's still prioritized that they are proficient at being able to support students' learning in mathematics and literacy, right? So with respect to science, we're seeing more science specialists, and there's a big debate about whether, because then the classroom teacher goes away and the science specialist comes into the classroom, and the science specialist teaches the science lesson and leaves, and the classroom teacher comes back, right? And they do other stuff. So kids think it's pretty special, right? Because it's treated like we call them specials in the curriculum. But the drawback on that, the benefit is that those teachers have more training, they understand some of the change that we're trying to do even more. But the drawback is it's disconnected to all the other learning, from all the other learning that children have in the classroom. So for example, a classroom teacher might notice that a child is struggling with a particular mathematics idea, but they don't, or literacy, but they don't ever, if you have a specialist teaching science who is more prepared to teach science, the classroom teacher doesn't see that the child may excel when they can use multiple ways of showing their understanding in science. So it's pros and cons, right? Like if you don't ever see that, then you have a deficit view of that child as being a struggling learner, but they may be flourishing over in the science piece. The same way the science specialist does that investigation, but they may not be able to connect back with other aspects of the curriculum or other ideas that an interest that a child has put on the table. So whether or not to have the specialization or not is a debate and an experiment of sorts. I don't know if I answered the first part, but that was certainly the second part. But no special training for mathematics. Most elementary people tend to specialize in, have more courses in literacy and language. We do have, for second language, for English learners, there are specialized teachers and a specialized certification for that. But again, separated from science. So it feels like we need to have sort of this interdisciplinary collaboration across the science discipline, or science teaching and learning, and language development, as well as, I mean, the other subjects too. But
thank you very much
did I
for
do it,
yes.
Joaquin? Did I do okay? Did I answer your question, Joaquin?
I think so. I don't know. Joaquín, si quieres complementar. Yes,
It's okay.
yes, Joaquín, yes, it's okay. It's okay.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to find another one. Yes, there is another one. I don't know who wrote this question, because it's from ICE to all of us. I don't know. Maybe it's someone of the staff of my organization. Thank you very much, Carla. A very interesting explanation. To involve children in their own learning, is the collaboration of parents essential to obtain good results, or is it only advisable?
It's highly advisable. I know that that's not always possible to include families, but to the extent that you can, there are levels of, there are ways, and we're talking about in the project that I shared, more than just keeping parents informed, right? Like sending a newsletter home, or sending photographs home, or sending work home. We're talking about engaging families in school settings with teachers in ways that teachers can better understand the needs of the community, the needs of the family, and connect up with that. And families can understand the ways in which we're working on science and sense making, even something as simple as not telling the answers, and what does it look like when you don't tell the answers. And so those kinds of things, and the different perspectives that people have on what science learning is, it's very important. And we have found that the community center is really a great place for that to happen, because they're used to families and parents coming in. And so if we can connect up in that space, it's great. Schools are a little harder, right, to get families to come in, especially immigrant families who are very uncomfortable often and don't know what education in America looks like, and how that might be different in the US than it is in their home country. But still really critical to build those relationships, if nothing else, to have parents as partners with us in this work. So my position is it has been absolutely essential, and there's more and more research that suggests the ways in which that can be beneficial. But we're not always talking about the same kinds of things. I mean, we're talking about parents like actually coming in and planning with us, or sharing their insights so that we can be responsive to that. And I know that that's where I fall down on the making it a requirement or a necessity, because that's not always possible, and families' working schedules and things like that become very difficult to accommodate, to make sure that this work can happen. But very important, and very much at the forefront of thinking in science education here in the United States.
Yes, because you highlighted also the importance of the connection between, not only with the families, because all the community education is linked with the university and the schools, teachers, families, the schools districts, and administrators. Sorry, and you highlighted the importance of the connection of all those agents, and furthermore, because of the negative attitudes that have the school teachers towards the science teaching and learning. So it is I think that it is a challenge that we have also here in Spain. We share the same
Yes.
scenario, yes, as you know, and maybe sometimes because we show us some examples that teachers bring to the school the nature and the opportunities to make children to think about how can they solve nature problems or science problems. And I think that this is a very, very interesting point of to engage the children at the school, and sometimes maybe the children can engage also their families, because maybe probably they speak at their homes what are they doing at the school, and probably this is a very good point to engage also the family. So
Yes, and I love the study that you did in which you asked families what their children talked about, and it was overwhelmingly science in the classrooms that where you were working with the teachers to improve science instruction. There's also a body of research that shows, and this actually is very interesting because it's not just in schools, it's in other settings as well, that when the child makes the invitation to come to the school or to the event or to the, like when the child is asking the family, that they're much more likely to come, right? So we did lots of things to kind of facilitate. We sent home science stuff, and had the kids write their invitations for their families to come to some events at the school and things like that. So yes, very important, if nothing else, to have the communication. A very concrete thing that one of our teachers did, our case study teachers, is that she, somehow she connected up with the parent of a child in her classroom, an immigrant child, and they were able, I think it was that there was another child that she had had the year before or something like that. And so they started to talk, and the teacher just invited her in. She said, why don't you, come see? And so the parent started coming in more and more frequently, and that parent then has become an ambassador to other families in the community. So if you can't have everybody, having one or two that can be sort of a parent or family advisory group. But it's about the relationship and the honoring of the cultural and the cultural values and ways of life and ways of knowing of the people in the community that's really important. So even, when we were doing our COVID online stuff, families that heard, we had translators. So families that heard the translation really felt like their kids were being included, not excluded from the learning community. So that was a little helpful thing too.
Thank you very much, Carla. There is another question from another Joaquin. This is not the
Yeah,
Joaquin
okay.
that you know. Is Jose
Okay.
Joaquin. Is Jose
Okay.
Joaquin Rodes. He's another professor here at the University of Alicante. And he says, thank you so much for sharing this work. My question is, how many children per classroom do teachers have? And I assume that depends on age, but I would like to know some context where you apply this experience.
So this varies dramatically across all of those school districts that you saw in Pennsylvania. Now think about all of the school districts in the United States. It differs quite a bit. They try to keep early grades smaller, but that doesn't always happen. So there were between 20 and 24 children in the classrooms where we were working when we started. That actually got bumped up this past year. The kindergarten classrooms had 28 children, which is too many 5-year-olds. But anyhow, but sometimes you might have a class coming through, because that's the other thing we're seeing, is that some, from year to year, it's not always even as well. But I would say that there's usually no less than 18 children, and oftentimes in the mid 20s in these K1 and 2 classrooms in this particular context.
And there is one more question from Jose Joaquin Rodes, and is what about general resources or tools they can use at school for teaching by researching?
So these would be resources for engaging in practitioner inquiry. Is that, I want to make sure I'm understanding the
I'm not sure.
question.
I'm not sure about the question. I don't know if it is related to general resources or tools they can use in the school during their research. Maybe I don't know if he is related to it is related to the if there are tools that are I no encuentro la palabra. I don't find the word in English. Sorry about that. It's like tools that are or I don't know if they are expensive or difficult to find, or tools that can use professional researchers, or are the tools more simple and the tools are very easy to find for a school teacher? I don't know if the question is in this way. I'm not
So
sure.
there are two ways that I think of resources to be able to actually implement in your classroom. Many schools don't have budgets in elementary for science resources to implement and then study. So so the project provides each participating teacher with a budget, and that budget they can use to get the science equipment, materials, resources that they need to work with children in their classroom. To study that, we have to be able to video record, audio record, take photographs, all of those kinds of things. So the initial group of teachers where we were collecting all of those resources, they all got an iPad. The project, it's a funded project, paid for that so that they had right in their classroom. If they saw a child doing something really interesting or a child was explaining something in their own way, they could pull out that and, go ahead and record it on the spot. And then that became an artifact that they brought back into the classroom. So there are different kinds of resources. In this particular school, the principal was very much about recording and analyzing video. And so he had a camera up front, that a video camera that teachers could borrow. He was incredibly supportive. So things that we really needed, if we needed copies, if we needed things that could be provided through the school district, he made sure that that happened. So that partnership, having him understand what it was that we were trying to do as an administrator, really helped facilitate that. But the project paid a lot of those expenses.
Thank you very much. And there is another question from Ruben.
Hi, Ruben.
Ruben Limeñana.
How's the baby? Not a baby anymore.
Not a baby anymore.
Oh.
And he says, fantastic conference, Carla. Thank you so much. I have a question. To see any positive point in the pandemic, do you think this pandemic situation has potential to engage children in science education? If so, any idea for doing this? Warm regards.
Well, I do think there are lots of opportunities around the science, right? With littlest people, we were already doing a little storyline around how germs, how to keep your friends from getting sick, right? Like how germs spread and things like that. Older kids can start to look at the actual science of transmission and modification of viruses and things like that. So the science underlying the pandemic and the response to the pandemic and the vaccine development and all of this is very rich for, I think, older children, but I think there are applications for young children. And I think that you'll see curriculum projects. Our National Science Teachers Association has published several curriculum projects for older children around the science of the pandemic. So I do think that that's a big potential. The elementary teachers are really worried about doing the germ transmission unit with the kids because they were worried that, because there were a number of deaths in that community among the family members of the children that we work because they were essential workers. So there were times in the meatpacking industry where the whole, like hundreds of people became ill and many died and things like that, where the families of these immigrant children work. And so they were very concerned that there would be a social emotional impact that would be harmful to the children this close. They were like, when we're back to just dealing with the flu next year, yes, we can do this, but we're very concerned about how to handle it, even the science of it, when someone has a close connection with a loved one who has passed because of it. So there's always that balance as a teacher. It's more than the content. But in terms of really rich science phenomena, it's pretty phenomenal. And we'll be facing it again. This isn't our last pandemic, I hate to say. So we will have opportunities to think about how to approach this. Maybe this becomes an explicit part of our curricula in thinking about how this works. But there's a terrible need in the United States. I don't know how you are there, but the anti-science movement is incredibly troubling, right? These alternative facts and alternative ways of, there are basic things to be a literate citizen in a democracy that people don't have, and that's a very real and urgent problem that we will need to move forward to be able to be responsive to these kinds of issues. But we have a large anti-vaxxer, anti-vaccination contingency in the States. In my own county, there's still 40% of the people who have not been vaccinated yet here. So even just the need for that, how a vaccine works, what's unique about this, all of those things would be very great for curricular focus. If you can figure out the balance, yeah.
Yes, but sometimes the crisis is a break point to change things.
Absolutely.
And so I don't remember any time that we were hearing as many news related to science as today, as this last year. So many, this fact can engage children to become a scientist.
Yeah.
So we have to take this opportunity and to boost the children to because you can be a scientist as this one, and you can discover or make big things or related to technology or science or medicine to improve the society. So this is a break point that we can take to boost the science teaching and learning. So
I agree.
yes. And there is a couple of more questions from Carolina.
Hello, Carolina. Congratulations on dissenting.
She says, hello, Carla. It was a real pleasure to listen to you. A very interesting presentation. Congratulations. I have remembered wonderful moments and learnings. I have the pleasure of leading this magnificent project. And she has a couple of questions. And the first one is, do you think the pandemic has affected the engagement of families and teachers?
Families and teachers together. Well, the interesting thing is that teachers had unprecedented access to homes and families had unprecedented access through the Zoom, the virtual environment, to classrooms and seeing teaching and learning firsthand. And I think the overwhelming position of families that I know were that, wow, teachers are really valuable, right? Like that, like I can't do this. I can't sit here and like teach my child at home and wow, look at how the teacher does this. And so there's an opportunity for professionalizing the profession, which has fallen away, eroded, at least in the United States over time. Teachers haven't had as much respect. So I think that piece is there. But in terms of the actual relationships, I think it's, unless there's a very intentional effort to have those connections with families, for the purpose of engaging around learning, that those didn't happen in quite the same way. So there's a valuing and a different level of understanding that came, but there's something about being there and having those connections and really being able to listen and be responsive that helps build relationships. And that piece was not around. So I'm hopeful, but I certainly don't think that we had the level of family engagement that we had beforehand, but the potential is there. If people hadn't been so focused on like, how am I going to teach the 10 kids that are in front of me and run the camera and teach the other 15 kids in my class from home all at the same time, like teachers were overwhelmed. Like this is very, and university instructors, this is very hard work to try and do this hybrid, in-person, remote. And so I think if any of it were to continue, that now that people have a sense of what that can be like, that there's room to think about, okay, now how do we get back to the family engagement and how do we do these other things? But you have to be intentional about it. It doesn't necessarily happen just naturally.
Mm. When Carolina wants a kind of advice because she says also, can you give us tools on how to support teachers to keep going and not to give up?
Oh, well, I think for all of us, right? It was a very difficult year. Our school year ended and everyone is exhausted. And so, lots of opportunities for professional learning didn't transpire. Like all of these things happened because people were just done, right? Like just give me some space to function after this year. So I'm hoping that and certainly we're in constant conversation. I'm headed down next week with the team to socially distance meet with our teachers from the case study teachers to kind of plan again for the future. So I think it's just being there, expressing understanding. These are relationships, and it's not like they're going through it and we're not. We're going through it. Different people are having different experiences. And so being empathetic and understanding and supportive in any way that we can, I think helps. So just being there, being supportive. Carolina, I know that so a little bit of background. Carolina, my first year with the deep dive teachers at the new school, Carolina she was visiting Penn State, and so she helped me deliver the class pet to a first grade classroom. This was a veiled chameleon, and the kids studied form and function. It's a great organism to do that with, and they wanted to know why its food was alive. So we ended up studying the food that it eats and its different adaptations and why it would need, how that gives them an advantage in their particular environment. Like it was just really, it was really great. She got to meet the kiddos. So come back, Carolina, and we'll go show you what's up now.
Yes, because Carolina, thank you very much from Carolina, and big hugs, and hope to see you soon, Carolina.
Air hugs, right? I'm really looking forward to a time when we can travel again, because it has been so valuable to interact with the group at Alicante, University of Alicante, and to share ideas, innovations, storylines for science instruction, ways of working with teachers. I know when I visited, you were teaching, doing the professional development work at one of your school sites, Asun, and it was wonderful to be able to attend that, to meet the teachers, to see that they have the same fears and the same struggles, but the same interest in supporting children. I think we can learn so much through collaboration. So thank you.
Sure. Yes. The last question that we have here written in the chat is from María Calero from the University of
Ah,
Valencia. Uh, thank you for sharing us. Thank you for sharing with us so many interesting initiatives, Carla. From your point of view, what role can education for sustainable development play within the framework of STEM in early childhood education?
oh, sustainable development. So this is also an area that's, and so I'm assuming like environmental sustainability is the focus of the question in early childhood education. Is that?
Yes, the question is focused
Sustainable development?
on sustainable development, the role that play within the framework of STEM in early childhood education. Yes.
Yeah, so in early childhood education, that's a huge, just finished working with a couple of colleagues to write a handbook chapter on early child science in early childhood education. And we actually compared early childhood systems in Spain and in Luxembourg and in the United States. But one of the things from that work that is always striking is the range that counts as early childhood education. Like, so we're talking about like from birth to all the way up to, so I don't know if I'm going to hit the sustainability piece, but the early childhood science piece, and then that stems up to about third grade, right? So from the time you're born to the time you get to third grade, like that's early childhood. That's a lot of territory. And so the way thinking about what science might look like with infants and toddlers, next gen science, uh, there are people who study just that, and really it's about not just teachers but caring adults and making sure that they can notice the science in the everyday interactions they have with children and build on those. So Daryl Greenfield writes about his work in professional learning with teachers of infants and toddlers around science, and it's so interesting because it might be that that a child, they oftentimes take points of frustration with children, right? So a child is frustrated because they've spilled a cup of juice, right? And so they're spreading it around. And so instead of saying, "Oh no, I'll clean that up for you," the adult, it's, "Oh, I wonder if this will clean it up." And there's a tissue, and I wonder, "Oh, how did that work? I wonder how this would clean it up." Grab a paper towel, grab a napkin, how different things absorb. So just diffusing the frustration in sort of the, when children are just developing language and don't always have the words to share, like to nurture that. It's okay to have that that spill isn't a bad thing. Let's work on investigating how to clean that up. So those things building to something that looks a little bit more like sort of playing off of students' intuitive need to investigate. And kids are really, to connect back up potentially with the sustainability piece, it's so important. And I'm not really sure how to answer that part other than to say that with climate change and with war and economies that are really problematic and the kinds of politics that we have, that migration is a response to those kinds of conditions, and they're global responses. And so we need to start thinking about like how to support even the youngest learners, but that's hard to do when people aren't settled in a community or don't have their home. So finding things that are local that matter to people about their community is, I think it's essential, not even just in early childhood, but throughout kids' entire schooling, is to make sure that you're connecting back up. I really feel, I'm going to stop because I really feel like I'm probably not answering your question, but there is exciting work, even with our youngest youngest humans on nurturing that natural curiosity and sort of welcoming questions instead of shutting them down.
Thank you very much, Carla. And thank you very much from the audience to you, because you have a lot of congratulations from the audience. Thank you, Carla. Thank you for your presentation. Congratulations for your work. Ruben baby is fine. Ruben.
Oh, good, good.
Baby
Can't
is
wait.
fine.
Baby in quote.
Yes.
Right.
Okay, so from Maria Calero, thank you very much, Carla. It has been a pleasure to listen to you. Congratulations on your presentation. And Jose Manuel Jimenez says, you engage or you bring us the motivation to keep working. So thank you very much, Carla.
I'm glad that came through. I'm so passionate about this work, and I feel like it's so urgent and important. And I'm just so open to learning from other people who are dealing with the same kinds of educational issues in other contexts. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you today. And I cannot wait till I can be back there with you in person. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carla, again for your acceptation to join us in this conference. And I'm excited to join in Spain or in US.
Yes, you're welcome.
Yes,
come back.
and share again all these wonderful moments. And thank you very much for your presentation. Your work is really inspiring. Thank you, Carla.
Thank you. Have a wonderful conference.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Adios.
Bye. Adios.